They say that the last 10% of a build can take 90% of the time. And they're right, but honestly, I think the same can be said for pretty much any smaller job as part of a bigger project. Right now, I'm working diligently to get the Honda-swapped Ferrari fired up for the very first time, and in the last episode I said we finally have all the parts and pieces needed to pull that off. But if you look behind me, this car is currently more taken apart than it has ever been at any point in the last year. So how close are we really? Well, the good news for everybody that's been watching through all these episodes is quite close. In this episode, I'm going to be laying out and setting up our chassis harness and chassis electronics because we're going to need those in order to control the engine. And then I'm going to hop into the engine bay and get some final fabrication done so the engine can go in for quote-unquote the last time. So let's get back to it. Let's cross some stuff off the list because I am tired of waiting for this thing to run, and I know you guys are too. With all of the work that we put into the engine bay of the car, I've completely forgotten about all of the things that we have to do inside of the car as well. The last time we were in here, we mounted the Nexus R5 ECU to the rear bulkhead and got some of our wiring laid out in place. But all we had at the time was the engine wiring harness and the sub-harness that connects it to the ECU. In the last episode, I showed you guys the new body harness that we received from Rywire, and I gave a quick rundown on how it's going to work. But now we need to get it laid out and take a look at exactly how we're going to fit it into the car, as there's a lot of wiring here and it only goes in one way. Most of it we're not even going to use at the moment. It's for things like headlights and taillights and radiator fans, but a little bit of it is critical for us to fire up the engine for the first time. Primarily, it'll allow us to connect our CAN pad and our digital dash to the ECU, both of which I'd like to have set up the first time we light this thing off. Now, because there's still a lot of interior work left to do, we're really only mocking this harness up so that we can connect the critical components for our first start. Now, the first piece of equipment that we need to add to the car today is one that we looked at in the previous episode, the Rywire PDM. The reason we're running this is because I have so many electrical components crammed into this car that I don't want to overburden the Nexus R5's internal PDM. And this will give us a lot of expansion and room to run more electrical components than we could have otherwise. The PDM is getting mounted directly next to the Haltech ECU, and because I don't have a good set of transfer punches, I'm using a paint pen to apply paint to the end of a steel drift and simply pressing it through the holes of the PDM onto the bulkhead to give myself an accurate drill pattern. I'm normally fine with drilling holes a bit oversized if I mess this up, but in this case, I want it to be perfect. The hardware I'm using to bolt in the PDM is only temporary, but we'll touch more upon that later in the episode. With the PDM in place, we've got the major electronics squared away, and I've got the rest of the chassis harness loosely laid out on the car's floor so I can get an idea of where everything needs to go. The next thing we need to locate is our CAN pad. This will be the interface through which we use to control all of the car's functions, everything from headlights and taillights to water pumps and fuel pumps, ignition, and more. And the three lights above each button will also be able to tell us the status of each circuit, so its location is critical. I took this video while I was sitting in the car to get an idea of where exactly I want this CAN pad to sit. The locations are relatively limited, as I need to be able to reach it while I'm strapped completely into my seat with my race harnesses, and I want to be able to see it without having to avert my eyes very far from the road. I played with a lot of different ideas on where exactly to put it, including right next to me and up above the windshield, but ultimately I think here in front of the shifter makes the most sense, so let's figure out exactly how we should mount it. The first option is to build some sort of tower structure off of the coolant tunnel that runs through the middle of the car, perhaps something that ties in aesthetically with the shifter base. On the other hand, we could build something from the structure underneath the dash, but there's not much to work with there, and I'm inclined to think that it wouldn't be very sturdy. So, coolant tunnel it is. I hopped into the car with a tape measure, a protractor, and some calipers, and took a bunch of rudimentary measurements so that I can build something in CAD that can support this panel where I want it to be. I also took some measurements from the back of the CAN pad itself so that we can build a mount that'll hold it, and we're in business. I booted up Fusion 360 and got to work drawing something that'll hold this CAN pad where I need it to be. I went through a lot of different revisions, but ultimately, I think I've landed on something like this. Now yes, I did get a little bit carried away on the details of this thing, and I'm going to revise it so it's a bit more tame in its overall aesthetic, but I was having some fun while I was making it. The idea is that this can hold the CAN pad where I want it, but it's also adjustable. I don't have to nail the position of it the first time. I can move the pad completely independently on 3 different axes, and I'm pretty excited about that aspect. This should also be pretty simple to make, because I can have the entire thing laser cut out of flat stock by Send Cut Send, and then all that's required is to fold it up and bolt it together. Once I have it in the car and know exactly where I want it, we can make a more permanent fixture. One of our last CAD projects was to build an ECU support bracket for the opposite side of the firewall, and today I want to build a similar bracket for our PDM. Ultimately, the goal is to give more structure to the very thin sheet metal that supports it. I want to make sure that I'm using the same design language as the bracket that's right next to it, so I'm basing all of its geometry off of the bracket we made previously. They're not the same size, so of course they're not identical, but I do think that they should look pretty good sitting side by side on the rear firewall. I'm also likely going to use this same design language when I redraw our CAN pad support mount, but that's for a future episode. It's good to have our electronics installed, but they're all pretty useless without actually having power. So we're going to need to build some battery cables using these Amphenol connectors that come on the Haltech ECU. I'm still waiting on the parts to make the battery mount, but in the meantime we can make the cables. These connectors are pretty cool in that they're a quick release and they look good. Hidden underneath the cover is the actual lug that needs to be crushed, and normally I would do this with a hammer, but in this case I want something a bit higher end. So I splurged just a little bit and I actually bought a hydraulic tool used for crimping battery connectors and other large gauge terminals. This thing was only $50 on Amazon, and I'll put a link in the description in case you want one too, but it made this job a breeze. And it's got every die you could need to crush pretty much any size terminal, period. What I don't have is a big set of wire strippers, so I'm using a razor blade the good old-fashioned way, but otherwise this process is super straightforward. After a couple of pumps with the tool, we're left with a really nice looking crimp, and it's rather strong to boot, and overall, I'm really happy with the outcome. This tool's going to come in really handy as we finish up our wiring. Forgive the sound, there's an excavator right outside the shop that has been going all day and it has made it impossible to record anything, and it may start again any second. But I've got the cables installed on the Nexus R5, and they're simply going to come up, and we're going to add 2 bulkhead terminals right here, one for power and one for ground. The only problem is those aren't here yet because FedEx or UPS dropped the ball, but these will get ring terminals crimped to them, and then we will use those bulkhead connectors to pass through the firewall instead of actually taking the cable and running it through the firewall itself. It should simplify everything, make everything nice and easy to disconnect if we need to, serviceability, and we don't have to worry about the bend radius of this stuff. Just in time for that excavator. Now, another thing that we need to do before we put the engine into place is I've got a lot of welding to do. Now, there's a lot of stuff back here. I'm not going to weld all of it. Most of it's just kind of stitched, but most of it also isn't necessary to start the car up. I want to focus on the things that are, such as making sure the engine mounts are solidly welded in and things like that. So let's do some cleanup and get that stuff burned in. Because everything rusts if you let it sit around in this shop, I had to start by cleaning it all up before I settled in for a night of welding. And it needs to be quite clean because I'm set on using the TIG welding process for all of this. That also means this is going to take a while because the TIG process is a slow one. So I cranked the tunes in the shop and got to work. Now, I said I only wanted to weld the critical things, but as I got into the evening, I realized that was a dumb decision. I'm definitely not going to want to pull all this stuff out again just to weld things up so that I can drive the car once it does run. So I decided to disassemble it all and pull a late night at the shop. As for continuing to use the TIG process, it's for the same reasons I've mentioned before. I want all the practice that I can get. And I know that if I ever want to TIG weld a tube chassis or a roll cage into a car, it's contorting myself into these odd angles that's going to get me there. Learning how to control the pedal with my knee or thigh or even elbow are only going to be learned from situations like these. I can't suggest that this is the right tool for the job, as this entire project would have taken a lot less time if I had simply used the MIG, but I'm happy with my decisions, and I'm always looking to increase the size of my toolbox, both literally and metaphorically. All right, it's the next morning. Camera died last night. I decided to just kind of stay in the engine bay and keep welding until pretty late. I think I got home, I don't know, around 11. It was a long day of welding. I even had to get out the MIG welder to get kind of some of those back corners around those down tubes. I'm not quite talented enough with the TIG to get back in there and do it well. But I will say, I really am so much happier and more comfortable using the TIG in a general sense these days. I was bummed to have to get that thing out. With that said, engine bay is pretty much all welded up. There's a couple of small spots still to get that I can get with the engine in place. Everything that matters and that is structural is done at this point. I feel pretty excited. Now, once we get it running, we can conceivably drive it once we have the running gear on the car as well, instead of having to take it all back apart again. All right, next on the list, probably some sensors. Of course, we need sensors to actually run the engine, so I bought a bunch of Honda factory sensors for us to install. Inside, we've got 2 cam position sensors, a crank position sensor, a coolant temperature sensor, and a vehicle speed sensor, all of which the computer are going to look for. For everything else, we'll simply use Haltech sensors or go completely aftermarket. But we're off to a bad start because, as you can see, the vehicle speed sensor I bought is the wrong one. It's nowhere close to fitting. Fortunately, we're not driving anywhere yet, and the other sensors are more important. The crank position sensor and both cam position sensors worked out perfectly. And then, of course, there's our engine coolant temp sensor, which is as easy as it gets. As mentioned, there's all sorts of other sensors, such as oil pressure, fuel pressure, temperature sensors, and so on that we're going to need, but all of those will be Haltech sensors that will integrate with the Nexus R5. Otherwise, we should be set for all of our wiring. All right, so we've got sensors on the engine, and the engine should be ready to go back into the car now, save for needing to install an exhaust and intake manifold gasket, but nothing that should keep us from firing this thing up. So now that we're here at the end of the episode, I want to talk about the actual checklist and timeline for when I want to fire this thing up, because I truly do believe we're pretty much there. The engine will go back in the car. I've got some fittings to make the last 2 remaining oil lines and a fitting to make the last coolant line that I've just been kind of spinning my wheels on for months at this point. When the engine goes back in, I want to fill it up with fluids. That's the goal for the next episode. Get all of the fittings checked, make sure we're not leaking anything, and get all of the wires hooked up. We have the chassis harness in place. We've got the engine harness ready to go back in. The only other wiring job that we have to finish is the battery cables. That was going to be in this episode. I wanted to have it done, but unfortunately, there are some pieces that just didn't show up. As mentioned before, I'm waiting on the bulkhead terminals that'll pass through the firewall instead of us having to actually run cable through the firewall itself. That'll be a nice, tidy solution, and I'm waiting on some battery terminals so that we can actually hook to the battery. Both very simple, and we'll be able to knock those out real quick once those parts show up, but they're not here. Thank you, FedEx or UPS. We're going to have our battery box in the next Ferrari episode. We'll get that installed. Overall, there's just a small handful of things that have to happen. I really think what I just named there is about it. The engine will go back in, we'll get it full of fluids, confirm our wiring, and then we will apply power to the Nexus R5 ECU, make sure that it's happy. We'll put a base map on it. We'll see if this thing fires up. It really is, I think, that close. My goal for that is 2 Ferrari episodes. Now, I don't want to underpromise. No, I do want to underpromise and overdeliver. I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. I know I've been saying, oh, we're a couple weeks away from this, but my goal at this point, 2 more Ferrari episodes for us to fire it up. We'll see how that goes. I do appreciate you guys with your patience and your support through this whole build. And for those of you that want to show support, I do finally have merchandise being made right now. Shirt designs are done. They are at the screen printer. I've got 2 t-shirts in the works. I should have them here in a couple weeks. The Patreon supporters will get first access to them. I didn't make a ton of them, but I want to make sure that everybody who wants one gets one. I'm really excited for them. I think you guys will like them, and that should be fun. Overall, I guess that's probably about all I've got for this episode. Tuesday's episode will probably be E36 based. I want to get the final pieces on the car. I want to get the door glass in, get the mirrors on, get the front lip on, get the side skirts on, and that should finish up the car aside from the interior, which we're waiting on. And I want to do all that because on Sunday, my buddy Blake is hosting an E36 meet for the date 3/6 if you are here in the US. And that seems like a pretty good, fun event to take the car to. I haven't taken that car anywhere in a long time. Why not have a reason to get it finished up and looking good? So we're gonna do that. I'll take you guys along for the fun. We'll take the car for a real drive, go beat on it a little bit, check out some other cool E36s and BMWs. It should be fun. I hope you guys enjoy it. I'll catch you guys on Tuesday or Wednesday or whenever I get my act together. I'll see you then. Thanks.